Who is Carrie? Chapter 7. Well, the cooks, they could hardly stand it. They puffed out their cheeks and stumped around the kitchen, and when they put down a pot, they didn't just set it down, but banged it on the table, all the while muttering under their breath about how it beat all, and what was the world coming to, and who'd have believed it in 1,000 years, and cursing a good deal too, until between the pots banging and the cursing, it sounded like an artillery drill around there. I didn't say nothing, but stayed quiet and did everything I was told, which was something new every 2 minutes. But inside, I was smiling. After we finished serving supper, me and Horace took our plates outside the way we usually done when the weather was favorable, so's to be away from the cooks. I told him about it. It shook him some, too. He frowned. Then he said, "Well, I expect I'll go to President Washington's, too. It's just that Mr. Francis hasn't got around to telling me yet." "Well, I hope you do, Horace," I said. I did hope he would go when the time come, because it would give me a friend over there. But for now, I didn't mind having something Horace didn't have for a change. "Yes, that's it," he said. "Mr. Francis don't want to let it out too soon for fear the other waiters will be jealous." "That's probably it," I said. "I am sure of it," he said. "I don't mean nothing by it, Carrie, but it don't seem likely he'd take a plain kitchen maid and leave behind somebody who is generally held to be the best waiter in New York and is a prince at riding besides." I was tired of him always saying I wasn't nothing but a kitchen maid. "You can't cipher," I said. "Dan can cipher." "Oh, I could cipher if I wanted to. There ain't nothing to it once you know. All you got to do is set your mind to it. I ain't had the time for it. Once I get around to it, it won't be nothing for me to learn." "Dan can count as high as he wants, too," I said. "Hundreds and hundreds." "Why, there ain't nothing to that, Carrie. I can count as high as I want to, too." "Let's hear you count to 100, I said. "Oh, I can do that easy, and I would too, but it'd take too long." "Dan," he frowned. "Never mind about Dan." Then suddenly he reached into his jacket pocket. "With all this chattering, you made me forget I got a letter from Willie." He took it out, unfolded it, and handed it over to me. Of course, it didn't mean anything to me. It was just squiggles on a page. "Read it to me, Horace." He rustled the paper around and frowned over it, and he read it out real slow. "Dear Horace, I meaned to write sooner, but it takes me so long. I am reading pretty good. Every day I read a story out of the newspaper. I write down the hard words and ask someone about them when I get a chance. I got a new job, cook at a tavern. I wished I was back home. I miss everybody. I don't dare come yet. Ride if Captain Ivers goes back to Stratford to stay for good. Willie." He read it so slow that sometimes he come to a complete stop and had to back up a little to get going again. It took near 5 minutes for him to get through it, but he done it, and then he was quiet, and I knew he was trying to think up some way he could get her back to New York. He missed her a lot more than he wanted to tell anybody. He was in love with her. I wondered if she was in love with him. When you come down to it, Horace was all right. If you scraped off all that shining and puffing, Horace was all right. He wouldn't steal anything from you, or cheat you, or take unfair advantage. Of course, he was tight with his money. He saved every penny he got and wouldn't lend nobody nothing, nor buy nobody cakes or punch. Once he bought Willie some ribbons for her hair, and it shocked the cooks so much they couldn't talk about anything else for days. They knew from that he was in love. And they teased him about it so much. He never done anything like it again, and if he did, he never told nobody. But leaving aside the puffing and being tight, Horace was all right, and I thought Willie might be in love with him too. If it had been me, I'd have picked Dan over Horace any time. In the end, Horace didn't get to go to President Washington's house. Mr. Francis took only me and the second cook. He said that the first cook and the rest had to stay to keep the tavern going, which was going to be under the hand of his wife. He said that the second cook would do all right. He would cook the cakes and puddings for President Washington himself. And so I left the tavern. President Washington had moved into a house on Cherry Street over near the East River, which had belonged to a rich man named Samuel Osgood. It was mighty grand. A big brick house, 3 stories high, with 4 great windows across the front. There was a slew of servants there, white servants and black ones too, that President Washington had brought up from his home in Virginia. And all sorts of coaches and a dozen horses, and the whole house just filled with stacks of fancy furniture and china and endless silver and carpets and such. Oh, it was the grandest place I'd ever seen. My work was mostly washing dishes and cleaning the kitchen and gleaming things in the dining room. I didn't hardly go anywhere else in the house. I was just kept mighty busy, too, for there was always something going on around here. Besides the President and Mrs. Washington, there were their 2 grandchildren. Some men who worked in government lived there, too, so as to be handy when the President wanted them. There was always people in and out. I was supposed to stay out of sight mostly, but sometimes when I was out in the dining room gleaming something, I'd see people go by in the hall. I recognized some of them from seeing them at the tavern. Mr. Alexander Hamilton. He'd come around to see the President a lot. So did Mr. Thomas Jefferson. It was funny to see them together, for Mr. Jefferson, he was very tall, and Mr. Hamilton was very short, and hardly come up to Mr. Jefferson's chin, but no matter, he was just as important as Mr. Jefferson. I wondered about that. How come tall folks wasn't more important than short folks? White folks was more important than black folks, but white folks hadn't done nothing to make themselves white any more than tall folks had to make themselves tall. It didn't seem to me that someone should be born important just because of how they was born. You ought to do something to get important. There was guests for dinner most every night. On Tuesdays, the President had a levee, which a lot of ambassadors and congressmen and such come and sat around the dining room and talked about the government. On Fridays, Mrs. Washington had her drawing rooms, which were all the rich people in New York dressed up fancy as could be, gabbled and gossiped and drank tea and coffee and ate cakes and candy. It was a powerful lot of work getting everything ready for the levees and drawing rooms because everything had to gleam like the sun, and it was even more work cleaning up afterward, and with having to wash 40 cups and 40 saucers and 40 cake platters and 40 knives and 40 forks and everything else. But I was mighty proud to be working for the President and happy to be where Captain Ivers didn't know where I was, too.